My name is Arthur Gildenegg. I'm a product manager here at Tableau, working on Tableau Prep.
I'm Yusuf Shukri, and I'm also product manager on Tableau Prep.
So today we're going to talk about deeper analysis through data shaping. So rather than describe what that is, let's just talk through a problem. So imagine you work in a hospital. Maybe some of you do. And your job is you want to understand how many of these are utilized or not utilized. And you've got a data set, and it looks like this. You have a bed, a person, when they were in the bed, and when they left the bed. So you're like, perfect, I can figure out utilization of those hospital beds, right? So I go into Tableau, and I build a viz like this. On the left is the beds. On the bottom is the time. And each one of the bars represent a stay in that bed. But my question is, how often are these beds utilized or underutilized? How do I answer that question? Well, the first thing I could do is just decide I'm going to count every single space and try to compare them. But that seems really hard. And the other problem is, this only shows me data for the times I actually have. So I don't see anything between midnight and 8 a.m. So how do I solve this problem, right? Many of you might have experienced this. I know in my life I've experienced this when I just want to walk away and say, I don't think I can answer this question with this data set. But with a little reshaping, we can build a viz like this. And I reframe the question to say, I want to look at bed utilization by hour. And so I can say these gray boxes, these gray squares, represent when that bed is unoccupied. And at the bottom, I can say, here's how many total bed hours where they're unoccupied. So same data set, some reshaping, and now I can answer a question I earlier didn't think I could. So that's why we say it's deeper analysis through data shaping. So I work on Tableau Prep. I've done a lot of ETL work in my past, and there's sort of three main areas when we talk about data preparation. There's cleaning. So I have maybe a number of values in a column, and I just want to standardize all those values. I might want to filter things out. Then there's combining data. I've got data in Oracle and SQL Server and MySQL and Excel spreadsheets, and I want to put them together. These two tend to get all the love in the data prep land, and the one that has helped me the most is reshaping. And the reason it's been important to me is because I can take the same data and ask lots of different types of questions that I just didn't think I could before. And I'd often spend a bunch of time thinking, oh, it's not a reshaping problem, it's a cleaning problem, or it's really a combining problem. But I really just had to restate that question and then try to reshape it to what I wanted. So if you have a data set and you feel like this, I want you to walk out of here and feel like you have some options. Okay, so when you walk out of this today, we want you to help be able to, one, identify, do I have a data shaping problem that I can go after? And second, we're going to talk about three different types of data shaping operations. And the way that we're going to do this is that we're going to talk about a concept around reshaping, why it's useful. Yusuf's going to do a demo of how to do that in Tableau Prep. And we'll talk about other places where you might encounter it. And at the end, we'll have some time for questions. All right. So the agenda really is, we're first going to say, well, how do you know what the shape of your data should be? Because if I can understand the shape of my data, then I can start to wonder about whether I have a data shaping problem. Or maybe I already have the right shape. So if I can figure out what my shape is, what shape I should have, and then I can start to think about what operation I should use. And we're going to talk about three main ones. Pivoting columns to rows. I always have to use the hand gesture because it helps me communicate what I'm thinking. We're going to talk about rows to columns, so just the inverse of that. And then completing a series. So I've got a bunch of values, and there are some values in a series that need to be filled in. So let's start with, what is the shape of my data? So sometimes we say our data is skinny and tall. Sometimes wide and short. That's how I feel about after all the fried food I've had. You could say that data set's very complete, so I'm not missing anything. I've got all 50 states in the US, for example. Or I might have gaps. But how do I figure out which one it is and which one I want? Main thing I want to focus on is, what does a row in your data set mean? So let's try this. This is a data set from the USDA all about school lunch programs. So let's see, what does a row in this data set actually mean? So we're highlighting 1971, and I see free, reduced price, full price, total. So what does a row mean here? A row means for a given fiscal year, how many people participated in those different lunch programs. So can I build a viz comparing full price to free, number of people in those programs, or compare 1971 to 1985? Well, I can go in Tableau and I can build a viz and I can do exactly that. That's because the shape of that data, what a row means, it actually facilitates being able to answer that particular question. So if you understand what a row in your data set means, you actually understand the shape of that data. And you'll hear lots of different terms based on who you're talking to. So if you talk to people in the data warehousing community, they'll say things like, oh, it's the grain of your data. At Tableau conference, we say it's the level of detail or the LOD of your data. Or people also say it's the data granularity. They all basically represent the same thing. So let's try it out. This is the process we tend to go through. We say, first, let's define the question. So get really clear about what are you actually trying to answer with the data set. And then second, you want to say, what is the grain of the data you have? Because I may not have the ideal data to answer a particular question, but if I figure out what I've got, I can start to maybe refine my question. And then say, well, what's the grain of the data you need to answer that question? And if the two don't match, then it might be time to reshape it. Okay, so we're going to use the same pattern as we go through every single example. So let's start reshaping. All right, so this is something probably many of you have encountered. I know encountered a lot. Data in an Excel spreadsheet. What does a row mean in this table? Let's take the very first one. Is that first day of the month? Second day of the month? Third, all the way down, it's cut off, but it goes all the way down to 31. And at the top, I have July, August, September, October, November. So if my question is, what are my day-over-day sales, is this the right grain? It's not, because it's really hard to compare the 31st on one day to the 1st of another day. It's really hard to actually build a time series on that. So I've got day of month. What I really want is daily. I want every single row to represent the sales for a given day. So I need to go ahead and pivot that from columns to rows. And so Yusuf's going to give a quick demo of that in prep.
All right. So before I started, with a quick show of hands, who have used Tableau Prep in the past? Okay, perfect. All right, so this is the data set that Arthur was just showing. I have a column showing me the day of the month, and I have multiple monthly sales columns. Each cell is showing me the sales for that day on that month. What I'd like to get out of this data is to build my sales over time, day over day, week over week, or month over month. With the current shape of this data, it's really difficult to do that. So we're going to use Tableau Prep to apply some transformation and shape this data into a shape that is possible to build this visualization with. All right, so here is Tableau Prep. I'm connecting to the data set. You can see all my fields right here. I see my day and the monthly sales. And what I'd like really to achieve, as you saw on the previous slide, is to get all these monthly columns to be to pivot them to rows, to have just a single daily date and a single sales field. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start using the pivot functionality in Tableau Prep. I have here the list of my fields. I can choose all the sales fields that I have and drag them as pivot fields. So I've selected all the fields except the day. You'll see that there is a checkbox here that says automatically rename pivoted fields and values. What that does is allowed Tableau Prep to detect that the word sales was present in all of these field names and it automatically called the new column it created sales. So that's pretty cool. And here are the month and the year values. So I'm going to rename that month and year so I can work with. All right, so now I'm almost there. I have my day, I have my month and the year, and I have my sales. So I'm going to do a couple of cleaning steps just to get it in exactly the shape I want it. So I'm going to add a step. And here I see that I have 32 values. I have a bunch of nulls in the day. So I'm just going to get rid of those. Now what I'd like to do is create a date field by combining this day and month and a year. So I'm going to go ahead first and change the type of this data to a string so that I can concatenate the day and the month and the year easily. I create a calculated field. I call it date. And I put my day, add a space to it, and then add the month, year to it. Let's see how that looks like. OK, so it looks like it's valid date format, 1 April 2017, 1 August 2016, and so forth. So at this point, I don't really need my month, year, and the day, so I'm going to remove those. So now I have the date and the sales like I always wanted, except that this is still showing as a string. So I'm going to fix that, make it a date. I realize I have some null values, so I'm going to just get rid of those. So now it seems like I have a clean data set that I can easily go and visualize. So let's go try that out. So I'm going to open Tableau Desktop. Right from within Tableau Prep, which is pretty convenient. And I'm going to add my sales as rows, my date as column, change the granularity to week, so I want to see week over week. And I can easily see my sales over time. From a data set where originally creating this visual was very difficult to a data set where I can do that with just a couple of clicks in Tableau Prep. Back to you.
Yeah. Thanks, Yusuf. All right, so not all pivots are quite as simple as that. Sometimes you run into data that's a little more complicated, right? So here's another set. Similar, I've got one row still equals day of the month, but I've got two things. I've got July. I have hit a button I should not have, sorry. I've got July 2016 at the top, and I have sales and tax. So I have two groups that I want to be able to pivot. We see these a lot in Excel reports or things that get exported from other systems. And it's a similar pattern. I want to go from day of month to daily. But I don't just want to do the same pivot we did before. I actually want to pivot two groups at the same time. So in Tableau Prep, we call this coordinated pivot. I want to pivot multiple groups in one action. And so Yusuf's going to show that.
All right, so here's the data set Arthur was just showing. It's very similar to the previous demo, except this is a little bit more complicated. Because for each, so I still have my day of the month, but for each month, now I have two values that I need to maintain and separate and report on separately. So I have my sales and I have my taxes. And I want to be able to see my sales over time and my taxes over time as well. OK, let's see how that's different. So I have my data set connected to here in Tableau Prep. The first thing I'm going to do, if you are a Tableau desktop or Tableau Prep user and you connect to Excel workbooks, you're probably familiar with this option. If I check it, it allows Tableau to understand Excel sheets better. So for example, here I have July, and I have two subcolumns, sales and taxes. By checking this box, you'll see that Tableau Prep guessed that these sales and taxes belong to the July 2016, and it called the column July 2016 sales or July 2016 tax. So that's cool. So it's the same problem as last time. So I need to have a date and the sales and the taxes columns. So I need to pivot all these monthly columns into rows. So I'm going to add a pivot step. And again, the same way, I have all my fields right here. Except last time, we picked all the fields except the day, and we used them as pivots. If I do this right now, the sales and the taxes values will just get combined. So that's not what I want. So I'm going to pick only the taxes. And there is a search functionality here that makes things easier. So I just search for tax, and I'm going to drag all the tax columns to pivot with. So that's great, and I still have my checkbox that automatically rename the pivoted fields. So the new field that was created is called tax. Pretty cool. The problem is I still have these sales fields. So maybe I can go and add a new pivot to take care of those. If I do that, the data will be wrong. I'm not going to do that now. I'm going to let you go home, try it out, and you'll realize that that won't work. As of, I think, July, Tableau Prep added this new functionality where you can add another level to your pivot, what we call coordinated pivot. So if I do that, in the same pivot, I can add another layer. In this case, I will add sales. So I'm going to pick all my sales fields. Let's see what that happened, what that did. So you can see here, I have a new sales column. I have my month in the year, so let's rename that, call it month year. I have my new tax field, and I have my day. Perfect, so I'm almost at the shape I want, so I will do the same thing I did last time. I'll add a cleaning step to do some cleaning. I'll change the day into a string so that I can combine the day column to the month, year, and form date column. So I'm going to create a new field, call it date, and combine the day, add the space, and the month and the year, and save that. Okay, that looks like it's valid dates. I'm going to get rid of the month, year, and the day columns. And last thing before I'm ready to visualize this is to convert this to dates, to actual date. It seems like I still have a few nulls, so I'm going to get rid of those. So now my data looks clean. So let's go check them out in Tableau. I'm going to drag my sales and my taxes as rows, my date, do it over week over week, and now I can visualize this data. If I like, I can make it, put it on the same chart with a dual axis, and again, with a very few clicks in Tableau Prep, I was able to transform the data from a shape where that was almost impossible to a shape where that's very easy. Back to you.
Awesome. So if you run into data like this, whether it's an Excel report, it's in PDFs, it's printed out to a text file, these are just a couple of techniques to help kind of wrangle that data. I know when I used to do a lot of ETL work, someone would hand me a spreadsheet like this, and I would just want to laugh at them and be like, I'm not going to clean that. And it's kind of nice to be able to be like, oh, now you can actually wrangle that stuff yourself and do it pretty quickly. And I actually worked with a customer recently who had 9 different groups that they wanted to pivot, and we were able to just pivot it in one step and move right onto the analysis. The other place where this type of thing happens a lot is survey data. So you have each line in a lot of survey data represents a single response. And you could have 20 questions, 50 questions, 100 questions, 1,000 questions, and they all show up as different columns. And you often just want to pivot that data so you can start to compare and analyze those questions over time. All right, so let's look at another problem. This is a book data set. I'm a little bit of a Neil Gaiman fan. Anybody like Neil Gaiman in the group? A couple people? If you haven't read Norse Mythology, it's a great book. So what does actually a row in this data set mean? So I've got a rental ID. I've got a book name, an author, a check-in, a check-out, and a date. And the question I want to answer is, how long are these books checked out for? Actually, I have to compare 2 different rows to understand how long they've been checked out for. So a row here really represents a rental event. Not a rental, but just some sort of event. It's been checked in, it's been checked out. So I start with the information on the left, my book rental, and I want to convert it, a book rental event, and I want to convert it to a book rental. So how do I do that? So that's called pivoting rows to columns. And we're going to show you what you can do in Tableau Prep today. We're working on ways to make this easier, but we want to make sure you guys can walk away and be able to do all the things with the most current version of Tableau Prep. And so Yusuf's going to do a quick demo of that.
All right. So here's my data set. This is the data that Arthur was just showing. And this technique we're going to use is very common with transactional data. So this is basically a list of transactions. Every time I check in a book or I check out a book, a new row gets added to this table. With each check-in and check-out, each unique check-in and check-out has a unique rental ID that they belong to. So I'm going to take this data, and I'm going to ask, I need to ask a simple question. How many days each of the books overall has been checked out? With this current shape, it's really difficult to visualize that. Unless you are an Excel wizard, you can go write some really complicated Excel formulas. It's difficult to calculate that value. So I'm going to go to Prep. I'm connected to the Excel sheet. I have my table right here. So I'm going to ask myself what I'd like to do with the data, with this data set, what shape, what kind of grain I want to create to be able to visualize, to calculate this, how many days each book was checked out. So first of all, in order to be able to measure how many days a book was checked out, I need to be able to diff the check out date and check in date for a given rental. So the granularity of the data is a given rental. So I would like to create a table where each row in that table is a single rental, and there is a checked out date, a check in date for in that one row where I can have a formula calculation to diff those dates and calculate the number of days. So I'm going to do that. In order to do that, first thing I want to do is I want to create, so right here I have a single date field that has all the dates for check-ins and check-outs. So I'm going to separate that out into two fields. One, I will call it check-out date, and one I will call it check-in date. So let's start by creating one for check-in date. I'll have a simple formula here that checks if my event is of type check-in, then copy the date to it. That's it. Let's see how that works. Okay, great. So now for each row that was a check-in, I have a check-in date. I'm going to go do the same for check-out. So I'm going to create a check-out date. And I will say if the event is check-out, if I can only type, then copy the date. Let's see how that works. Okay, perfect. So now I have a check-out date, a check-in date that are still in separate rows. So the next step is each two rows for each rental, I want to combine them to become one row. The way to do that in Tableau Prep is using aggregation. So I'm going to add an aggregate. Let's do that again while I'm zoomed in. There's an aggregate step right here. And for each aggregate step, I need to pick what fields I'm going to group with and what fields I want to have aggregated. So in this case, I want to group with rental ID for sure. That's my granularity level. And I'll add the author and the book. For aggregated fields, what I would like to aggregate, the fields I'd like to combine are the check-in and check-out date. So I'm going to drag those as aggregated fields. Here by default, the aggregation was picked as count, so I'm going to change that to maximum. But really, I know, given the original data, that each aggregated group is basically just two rows, and each of those two rows have one check-out date and one check-in date. So I'm just picking the maximum, knowing that it will only show me the date that I want. So I'm going to do that for this as well. And let's go look what the data looks like. OK, great. So now I have a single row for each of my rentals with a check-in date and check-out date. So what's left is just to do a simple calculation to calculate the number of checked out days. So I'm going to call this days checked out. And I'll use a date def function. I only care about days, really, so I'm going to use the day granularity. And the first date is the check-out date. I always get this wrong. So the check-out date is the start date, and the check-in date is the end date. So let's go check this out. OK, so for this rental, for example, the checkout date was 10/14, the check-in date was 10/19. The day's checkout is 5, so it seems like calculation is correct. And I think we're ready to go visualize this data in Tableau, so I'm going to do that. So I'm going to add the book as a row, and I'm going to add days checked out. So now I can easily find out which books were checked out the most, which books were checked out the least, which was very hard to do with the original data set.
Awesome. Thanks, Yusuf.
Yep.
So that's an example of a simple pivot of rows to columns. I just want to talk about a few other examples where you might experience this in the wild. So one is you might have highly normalized tables. So it's common to have sort of key value pairs. So for example, you have first name, last name, employer, birth date, first name, last name, city, for example. And it's just a very generic structure that sometimes development teams or ERP systems use because they can put data in there really easily. Makes it impossible to analyze in this shape in any real way. So what you want to do is say, I want to take these key value pairs and I want to convert them to something like that. So that's one example of where you might want to pivot rows to columns. You might also see this if you're parsing something like JSON data or have a bunch of key value pairs. The other place, I used to work in telecom for a long time. And so the other place you might see it, again, another generic type structure, although you see this in digital advertising, advertising in general, you see something that says, hey, I've got a date. In this case, I have a telephone number. I have a type, calls, SMS, megabytes. And then I've got some sort of counter value on the right. Do I want to hand this data set to someone, or do I want to build this data set myself that sums up the count? I do not, because I will get nonsense. I don't know what a number of SMS and megabytes together turn into. Right? So I want to turn it into a structure that makes it easy for me not to get the wrong answer. And so that's where I might want to take these two fields and pivot them from type and count to call, SMS, and megabytes. This is how you can take really generic data structures that are sometimes used and are really convenient for building applications and flip it so you can actually do analysis on it. Okay, so let's go back to the question we started with, the hospital bed utilization problem. So what does a row in this data set mean? This is just a bed stay. How long somebody stayed in a given bed. We had to be HIPAA compliant, so it's all person one, person no. This is all generated data. But the grain of this data is a bed stay. What I want is to go from bed stay to bed hour. Was there a person in that bed in that given hour? And that means I have to fill in values like this at the bottom in red, where I've got bed A, 3 p.m., but it's empty. I need to know when it's empty. And to do that, I need to do series completion. And so Yusuf's going to walk us through how to do series completion in prep.
All right. So here's the data set that Arthur was just showing. And if you remember early on in the presentation, we had a couple of slides that were showing what you can do with this data and what you'd like to do with it. So if you remember, what you can do with this data today is you can build a Gantt chart. You can pull how your beds are being occupied. But it would be very hard out of this to determine when was it unoccupied, right? So what I'd really like to build is I want to build a grid of all my hours in the day and place my patient which of these hours are occupied by patients, and the unoccupied hours are marked accordingly, so I can easily spot when the bed utilization over my entire day. And it's worth noting that this data is for just one day. It's for a 24-hour period, right? So before I go to that Tableau prep to start building towards that visualization, I need to create two simple tables first. One that has the list of all my hours of the day, so it's just a simple hour list from 1 to 24, and a list of my beds that I have in my hospital. The reason I need those is I need to build this grid that has all my hours and all my beds as an empty table that I will fill in the information, the patient information inside. Okay, so let's go to Tableau Prep. So I have here, I'm connected to that Excel workbook. I have my beds and my dates. So I'm going to start by building this empty grid first. So I'll drag my beds, and you can see it has 4 values for my 4 beds. I drag my date, and it has my 24 hours. So the first thing I want to do is I want to combine those into a grid to build a table that has hours by beds. In order to do that right now, I don't have anything to actually join with, so I'm going to Sheet and create a temp join field that I can use for joining. So I'm going to create a temp join. So I added, let's do that again. I added a calculated field, calling it temp join, and I will give it the value of 1. I'll do the same for my beds. Call that temp join, give it a value of 1. Now I can join these 2 data sets or these 2 tables based on that 1 field. The way to do that, I'm going to drag this towards this, and I will see options to join or union, so I'm going to drop it off on join. And it automatically detected that the temp join is the field that it was going to join on because it has the same field name and it has the same value, so that was easy. The join type doesn't really matter because this is a clean join. All the rows match. So what it really did is just build a grid of 24 by 4. So if I look here, I can see that the summary of the join, one data set participated 4 fields, 4 values, and the other 24. So the result is a grid of 96. That sounds right. So now that I created that, I can go ahead and just delete this temp join field, since I no longer need that. OK, so now that I have this empty grid, I need to bring in my patient data and fill in this data into this grid. So I'm going to drag my hospital beds table and look at it. So I have which bed, which patient occupied, what start time, and what end time they spent on that bed. So the first thing I need to do in order to be able to make this data compatible with this table I built is to change the start time and end time into hours. So I'm going to convert or extract a start hour from the start time and an end hour from the end time as separate columns. So I'm going to create a calculated field. I call it start hour. And I will use a function called datePart that extracts a certain part from a date. And I choose that part to be an hour. And I'll pick my start time. So my start hour is 8, and my start time is 8:34, so that seems like the calculation works. I'm going to add another calculated field. I will call it end hour, and I will do the same. Date part. Take the end date, end time, and save. OK, so now I have an end hour and a start hour for each patient, the time they spent on a given bed. So I can now join this data with the grid I built to fill in the patient information. So I'm going to drag this again and drop it off on join. Now it gets interesting, the join clause, the join condition that I'm going to apply. So first, of course, the bed has to match. So I'm going to say bed equal hospital bed. And then I want this patient to be marked as occupying a bed all the time from the start hour till the end hour. So I'm going to say the hour is greater than or equal the start hour, and the hour is less than or equal the end hour. So let's go check how this looks like. So the join type, before we go check it out, we need to set the join type. In this case, the join type does matter, right? Because in this case, I want the big grid, the empty grid, all of it to be included in the result. So I really need the output of this to stay a 96 cells grid that has all my hourly data. So I'm going to choose a left join. And if I look at the summary of the join down here, I can see that the result is 96. So that sounds right. Also, very quickly, Tableau Prep gives you some visual indication on what's happening during the join. So I can see that for bid A, from hour 1 to hour 7 is excluded, is red. So there is no patient information for that period. OK, does it make sense? Let's go check out. Let's go look at the data, the patient data we have. You can see that for hospital bid A, the first hour I have is 8. So that seems right. So that validates that this join works. So at this point, I will add another cleaning step just to do some house cleaning. I don't need the end hour and start hour anymore, so I'm going to remove those. I have my bed, and I have, actually I don't need the hospital bed as well, so I'm going to remove that. So I have my bed and my hour that's building the grid. I have my patient information, filling in which rows of those were occupied by that patient. And I have a bunch of nulls. So those are basically the hours that the bed was unoccupied. So I'm going to replace the null with unoccupied. So my data is cleaner. And then I have my start and my end time. So let's go check this out in Tableau and see if we can build this visualization that we originally wanted to build. OK, so I'm going to drag the hour as a column and the bed as a row. So now I built, and let's make it fit. So now I built this grid, and it's an empty grid of all my hours in the day, and I want to fill in the patient information. So I'm going to drag patient to color. And I have all this pink is the unoccupied, so I'm going to change that to maybe gray. I think that's gray. Now with a quick look at this, I can tell which hours had which patient in which bed and which hours were unoccupied.
So series completion is the most complex example we showed here today, but it's really powerful, especially when the questions that you want to ask are things like utilization questions or what didn't sell. Maybe you have telemetry coming off a machine, and you want to find out when a machine's not running or not reporting data. You want to see when an item is not selling in a particular store, maybe during a promotion. That's when series completion is when it's most powerful. So we're just scratching the surface in terms of what's possible when you do reshaping. And there's a lot of other options that we won't talk through if we don't have enough time to talk through today. But things like being able to add different level of detail calculations help with reshaping, as well as being able to do things like ranking. So if I can say I've got a window of data and I want to assign the first, second, third, fourth, fifth option, it's another common reshaping technique, as well as being able to show intersections or exceptions between two sets. And also just being able to do things like flatten JSON, because JSON data is often just captured in a single field, and you need to be able to reshape that. So just as a quick summary, I said I want to make sure people can walk out and say, when do I have a data shaping problem? So make sure you define the question you're trying to answer. Sort out what the grain of the current data you have is, what the grain you need to answer that question is, and whether you actually need to reshape it if the two of them don't match. And remember, we got 3 techniques we showed you today: pivoting columns to rows. That's just a simple pivot, a coordinated pivot, as well as pivoting rows to columns, and filling in a series. That's all we have for today. Thank you guys so much for coming. And if you have any questions, feel free to come up and we'll help answer as much as we can. Thanks for coming to conference.
Very good.
Hi, thanks.